Alright, welcome to Class 8. This week we are going to talk primarily about performance measurement, which is the definition and use of specific indicators to measure the outcomes and efficiency of a program. You probably already learned this in other classes and can spend an entire semester just on performance measurement, writing good measures and benchmarking, etc. But I'm just going to do a quick overview and then show you how we apply this to contracts. Honestly, each year I teach this course, I consider taking this lecture out because some of you have already had this and been exposed to it. And it's really hard to teach in just one sitting. I keep it in because I think it's important to incorporate performance measures into contracts so you can hold vendors accountable and report to the public that services are being performed well. So the first part of the class will be general performance and measurement information, background, and execution, but not necessarily tied to contracts. And then we'll discuss how performance measurement can be used in contracts to ensure services are carried out accurately and completely. And finally, our special topic this week will be commodities contracting. All right, so measuring performance is crucial because it links actions to an organization's mission. Pretend you work for a police department, and you can't just say you're going to increase community safety, because what does that really mean? But you can say, we will reduce the number of car break-ins by 10% over 1 year in the Northside neighborhood, which is one indication of a safe community. Performance measurements provide data to decision makers. Hold on, my cat just came in. I'm going to pause this. Well, I can't get my cat to leave, so he's just going to stay in the shot. Say hey to Buster. He's back there. All right. Performance measurements provide data to decision makers so that the activities of an organization can be adjusted to reach desired outcomes. Similarly, performance measures are used to justify budget expenditures. Our mythical police department may say, give us X amount of money and we will reduce the number of car break-ins by 10%, or because we have gotten this much money, we were able to reduce the number of car break-ins by 10%. And finally, performance measurements help an organization document progress towards an established goal. The police department could say that we have decreased car break-ins by 8%, so we're very close to our 10%. All right. So for those people that work extensively in performance measurement and tracking, there are tons of terms you have to be familiar with, which I've included here. Organizations use these terms differently depending on their objectives and using performance measurements, but I'm only going to give you a quick rundown. The first list on the left, they indicate the inputs, outputs, outcomes, targets, efficiency, explanatory information, and are all ones that I'm going to talk about individually in later slides. But we'll talk about a little bit about activities, which are kind of self-explanatory. They are the actions of the organization taken towards the stated goal. Demographics and breakout categories are ways of cutting the data that you gather when tracking performance. Going back to our police example, you may want to only capture data of car break-ins in Hispanic neighborhoods if that particular effort was targeted at Hispanic victims. Service quality characteristics and customer participation and customer satisfaction all refer to external service indicators and help a government assess how it is providing for its citizens. These are very common goals of performance measurements because we often want to know how we're doing when it comes to citizen needs, and measuring how well we're doing, how clients are participating, and how they feel about the services is really important to the municipality. All right, inputs are the resources that you put into a particular effort. The most common inputs are money, staff time, equipment, and supplies. These are the things that actually make the work or activity happen. To reduce car break-ins, you will have a lot of inputs. Officer time, patrol cars, maybe video cameras, and the time to install them. If you need something to make the performance measurement itself happen, that's an input. Outputs are the actual products of what you've done. These are expressed in physical, definable units. For our police example, the outputs would be the reduction in the number of car break-ins. So it's something very quantifiable. You had 10 one month and you had 8 the next month. Outcomes are the benefits produced by a program or effort. What good came of the efforts of the activity? For example, for our example, the outcomes would be a safer community. It is really easy to get outcomes and outputs confused. The key is that outputs are easily defined and quantifiable, and outcomes are more touchy-feely, like kind of emotional type things. So remember the first slide where I said our performance measurement is to reduce car break-ins by 10% in such and such neighborhood. That's really more of a target. A target is when you set a certain goal for the inputs you contribute to a project and guides what your outputs and outcomes are directed towards. These are always quantified in some way and can come from other municipalities' past experience or just what you hope to do. They often need to be revisited over time as you get better at performing a service or as priorities shift within the organization. So efficiency is the ratio of inputs to outputs or outcomes, though outputs are a lot easier to measure because they're quantifiable. Most often, these will include dollars as your input because we all know that local governments are concerned with how they spend their money and are constantly having to show that they're providing a good deal for the taxpayers. For our break-in example, the efficiency might be the cost of the cameras and the additional patrols versus the percentage decrease in break-in occurrences. So I think of explanatory information as the bullet points below the list of measurements. They help color in the story of why a goal was achieved or why it wasn't. This information could be about external factors that prevented the project from being successful, like a new gang moving into the neighborhood you were targeting, or fewer break-ins, or about internal factors, such as budget cuts. So there could be things outside of your control that might affect the success of your performance measure, so the explanatory information kind of captures that and tells the whole story. When you're writing performance measurements, specifically targets, there's an easy mnemonic to remember: SMART. All targets and goals should be SMART. Targets must be specific, meaning that they pertain to a particular effort you're trying to assess. They must also be measurable. You can't track something that you can't quantify. Remember how I said that you can't just say you want to make the community a safer place? You have to say that you're going to reduce specifically car break-ins by a specific percent, 10. The incidence of car break-ins is something you can quantify easily by using crime report data. Targets must also be attainable. What that means is that you should be able to achieve it if efforts are dedicated to the effort. A 10% reduction in a specific type of crime is more attainable than eliminating that crime altogether, and by being attainable, the target becomes both legitimate and helpful. Similarly, targets must be realistic. Not only should you be able to accomplish something, you should also be able to start it in the first place, both legally and politically. I don't think any city council member would object to reducing car break-ins, so that is realistic. Finally, performance measurements must also be timely. Do they apply to a current issue, something that is of concern to the community right now? If not, it's probably not worth the effort of working towards that goal. So performance measurements are great because they direct activities and communicate priorities within an organization, but they're not perfect nor always necessary. They don't, in and of themselves, tell why an outcome has occurred or how to improve an outcome that didn't turn out the way you wanted it to. Further, they don't always capture unintended consequences. For example, at the same time you're working to decrease car break-ins, the extra patrols and video cameras may also be reducing other types of crime in that neighborhood, and that's not really captured in the measures themselves. Alright, let's see if we can get through a little more before the timing cuts out on me. So enough of performance measurements in general. Let's talk about how you can use them in contracts you put in place with the selected vendors for a service. For this part of the lecture, let's use the example of a residential recycling collection service provider, because we've talked a little bit about that earlier in the class. So we haven't gotten to contract writing yet in the class, but we did discuss negotiation, and often tracking the performance of your vendor will come up extensively while negotiating a contract. Typically, the performance measurements would go in the scope of work, if they pertain to the actual work the vendor is going to be doing. We'll discuss this a lot more next week when we talk about actual contract sections and portions, but it's really important that in the scope of work that you've written for the RFP, that it becomes part of the actual contract, so the performance measurements that you write for the RFP will also become part of the contract. If possible, it's ideal to set and communicate performance measurements really early so that the vendors know what they'll be expected to achieve, but eventually it's most important that they get into the contract. There may also be unofficial performance measurements, like by hiring a company to empty recycling carts, you hopefully don't have to tell them that they have to service all the recycling carts on the given day. They should just do that. But then again, it's also really good to include that sometimes, so you have to kind of be careful about assuming your vendors know what they need to do. Excuse me. So once you've found a place for your performance measurements in the contract, you have to keep track of the vendor's performance. These three methods are discussed in your LaRue book, but I'm going to run through them really quickly. Direct monitoring is when the government follows the activities of the contractor very closely, observing everything they do. You could follow the recycling truck all day long to make sure the vendor's driver services each neighborhood, street, and address. But really, what fun would that be? Follow-up monitoring is when you check that they did everything, but don't necessarily follow their every move. For the recycling vendor, a town employee could just drive around the neighborhoods that the vendor was supposed to service at the end of a certain day to make sure all the carts were emptied. Again, it can be pretty time-consuming. Then monitoring by exception is when you only complain to the vendor about poor performance when it's reported by recipients of the service. For example, this would be when a citizen calls a town to report the recycling wasn't collected on their pickup day. This is by far the most common type of monitoring because it's inexpensive and doesn't require as much employee time, but it's also the least effective because it allows the vendors to make mistakes before the municipality does anything about it. So monitoring performance sounds simple, right? Just stick your performance measurements into your contract, keep an eye on the vendor, and everything will be rainbows and puppies. Unfortunately, that's really not the case. Including and enforcing performance measurements is very much easier said than done. First, it's hard to identify measurable indicators for contracts. Recycling is easy enough, but what about software implementation or insurance consulting? It can be hard to nail down what success in a service really looks like other than they got the job done. Similar to identifying performance measures, it's also hard to collect data on them because it takes time. Direct monitoring is really hard and takes a lot of time, and if you're going to pay someone to follow around the recycling truck all day long, why not just train them to drive the recycling truck and pick up the garbage carts? Like, why have two employees basically doing that at the same time? Commitment and resistance are two sides of the same coin. Once you've hammered out performance expectations for a vendor, your contract manager has to commit to tracking them and reporting when the vendor isn't meeting those standards. This often causes resistance on the part of the contract manager because it's a lot of work and often you have to blow the whistle on the vendor. If you're communicating with the vendor every day, like contract managers often do, they get to be your buddy and you really don't want to call your buddy out and get them in trouble. So it can be hard to incorporate these types of performance measurements and actually enforce them later. So how do we include performance measurements if it's so hard to do it up front? First, start early. Think about what targets will be appropriate for the service you're soliciting. Identify where you're going to get the data and if there are any obvious places to collect it. For the recycling example, where could you collect this data? Most trucks are equipped with GPS devices that track their location and how many times the arm raises recycling carts and dumps them in the truck. You could use that data collected by the tools to determine how many addresses they service, so that data collection is kind of built in. Performance measuring and monitoring take time, but you have to do it and continue doing it. You can't decide to not to look in on the vendor for months at a time and then be surprised when they're not doing their job. It helps to get the staff that will be monitoring the vendors to buy into the plan as well. If they're not willing to report poor performance of the vendor, you might as well not include performance measurements in the contract at all. Finally, be realistic about measuring performance. There's only so much time and money you can put into keeping an eye on the vendor so you don't have a technological or otherwise unworkable solution. And if you get into that situation where you can't collect data or there's just a kind of block on how you do it, you need to take a step back and reassess your measurements. So we'll discuss contract management a lot next week, but using performance measurements in your contract, you may often identify poor performance at some point, so what do you do in that situation? There are a lot of steps in the LURE chapter, but I'll kind of give you a quick overview of those. Step one is basically just call the supervisor or someone really close to the services being performed at the company and make sure you notify them of what's going on. If that doesn't work, you can escalate to the manager of the company with a phone call or an email. I suggest doing this in writing, or it really may not happen. Often though, I really just kind of move on to step 3, which is a formal sit-down meeting with the manager at the company and anyone close to the services if you've gotten to that point. We'll be discussing liquidated damages next week, so don't worry too much about that now, but basically it's a way to charge the company for non-performance. And then if you forget all these steps, that's fine. The most important thing to keep in mind is to communicate with the vendor early and often about service issues. If you don't, you'll run into a lot of more issues down the road. I'm going to pause the lecture now, and everyone make sure you go back and get part 2.